Welcome to another episode of exclusive interviews with subject matter experts. My name is Scott Kokenauer, and I'm glad you tuned in. Joining me today is Charles Stone. Let me share a little bit about him. He's been a pastor for 40 years, serving as lead pastor, a teaching pastor, associate pastor, and a church planter. He has earned an engineering degree from Georgia Tech, a master's of divinity from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a doctorate of ministry from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. But his most recent degree is an executive master's in the neuroscience of leadership from the Neuro Leadership Institute. He's completing a post-baccalaureate certificate in therapeutic models of mindfulness from Wilfrid Laurier University and a graduate certificate in mind, brain, and teaching from Johns Hopkins University. You can see here the website where you can find Charles. He is at charlesstone.com, and I want to bring him on here. And Charles, thank you for joining us.
Scott, great to be with you.
Yeah, that's quite a laundry list of things, and I didn't even include some of the other trainings like Professional Christian Coaching Institute and all that. I'm most intrigued by the degree from the Neuro Leadership Institute and the neuroscience of leadership. That's neuroscience and leadership coming together. It's pretty fascinating, and we'll get into that in a moment. But I thought we'd start by starting from the beginning. What was it like growing up as a Charles Stone?
Well, I grew up in a traditional family. I had one sister, and we always had a dog or a cat. And my parents were believers, so it was a relatively stable family. We didn't have lots of extra money. My dad was an engineer, so our basic needs were taken care of. And I was a geek. I never was a very good athlete. Just to give you an example, I tried out for the basketball team. I was not coached in what you're supposed to be, attire you're supposed to wear. So I wore sandals and bright orange socks. I did not make the team.
Did you make the cheerleading squad?
No, I did not even make that. I could run fast, but that was about it.
Okay.
But, pretty normal upbringing in the southern part of the U.S.
Sure. Okay. So do you have a fond memory as a child that you think back on?
Well, a couple of fond memories. One of them was I love animals. I love water. And when I lived in outside Atlanta, down the street in the woods was a pond. And when my mother couldn't find me, she knew that I was always there. I was pulling up rocks, looking for salamanders and pollywogs and those kind of things. So I just loved spending time alone and doing that. And one other memory, one of my earliest memories, I think I was maybe 6 years old. I was kind of a sickly kid until I had my tonsils out. Then I got healthy. I was in Lloyd Nolan Hospital in Birmingham, Alabama. And this is the days before private rooms. It was just this big ward, kids ward. Yeah. I think I must have had pneumonia or something. But I was so lonely and just, missing my parents. And I remember one night at the end of that hallway, way down at the end, I saw someone walking toward me. And it's my dad. He'd come to visit me. And I remember he brought me a little pack of juicy fruit gum, a little yellow package. Yeah. I just remember that. That was just a very significant moment for me.
Oh, that's great. That's great. It's great to be able to look back on moments like that, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is.
2020, obviously that is the topic on everybody's mind, and a little bit into 2021 as well. But are there any lessons that you've learned in 2020 that surprised you? I mean, all about leadership, about pastors. Mm-hmm. Was 2020 different than most years?
Yes.
No, I mean, well, of course it was. As far as impacting leadership, what surprised you?
Well, I think 3 or 4 things stand out to me. One of them was that I never imagined not going to church over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. Like, as we're taping this right now up here in Canada, in Ontario, we're on a very significant lockdown. We've not had church for like 4 weeks, and we can't have it for another 3 or 4 weeks. And we were locked down in March as well for 10 weeks or more. So I never imagined that. And yet it opened up opportunities for us to expand online presence, maximizing technology. So that's one lesson. Another lesson I learned, and I had to come to this understanding about a month into when COVID really hit, in March, that expectations revised downward did not hurt as much as I thought.
Okay. Okay.
Because, I still had dreams and still do for our church, continuing to grow and reach the community. We'll still do that. But what they're saying now is it's going to be on a smaller scale. Once I came to that settled conviction, I realized, okay, I'm okay. God's got me through this. Changing that a bit is okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a third lesson, Scott, was this, that constraint, which we all are experiencing, can lead to creative change. It can. It can choose not to. And
Right.
one specific way that I've done this is, obviously, one of my crafts is public speaking. It's bringing messages as a pastor. And I'm a kind of techie person. I'd use the iPad to follow along my notes when I would speak. But I embrace a new way of communicating, since we'd still do a very high quality, with the size of our church, high quality online experience. I found ways to use my iPad in ways that maximize attention of the listener. So this forced constraint led to these insights.
What do you think makes the difference between someone who, say two people experiencing the same constraint? One becomes more creative, the other doesn't. What do you think is one of the things that makes a difference?
That's a very, very good question. So I'm going to kind of answer off the top of my head. I think that God wired all of us differently. While I think I'm rooted in the present, I'm always thinking about the future.
Mm-hmm.
What can be the next hill to climb? What's the next goal to set? And that's one of the ways I've kind of kept myself mentally healthy, not staying in the okay, we can't do this and can't do that, but this is an option going forward. So I think a person who has that kind of a mindset, whether they're wired that way or they grew up that way, I think that's important. I think secondly, I alluded to this, mental health. Mental health has really been a huge conversation point during this time. We did a message series on this. I think I'm probably fairly mentally healthy, but I realize I got weaknesses and I work on those.
Right.
But I came to a point like a month into this, when I called my whole, like the first month, it was just I worked 25 straight days, one day off. Don't recommend that, but when you have to, leadership has to rise to the top.
Yeah.
But when I came to some of these changing expectations, kind of get into a new routine, my mind was clear, and I began to think how I can maximize, with limitations, constraints, what we are. So I think mental health, keeping good mental health, helps that mindset.
Yeah, I've for years subscribed to the idea that we don't rest from our work; we work from our rest. Therefore, it's an investment and not a leftover.
Yes.
And every day starts the night before. And that's I have violated it enough times to prove that it is actually true. We work from the rest that we get, and then that gives us the energy, and makes us mentally healthy as well. So, so speaking of 2020, in my reading, the fact that you are mindful can be an incredible, powerful thing for a leader. Talk to us about mindfulness. I know you've been really studying this and the plasticity of the brain and all that sort of thing. How do you stay mindful, and what is it all about?
Well, my journey actually began some 30 plus years ago on a Christmas morning in a high chair. I was not in the high chair, but my youngest daughter was. Yeah, like a little older than that.
Okay.
Our youngest daughter, Tiffany, was a year at the time, and my wife and I, and our three preschoolers, were visiting her parents in Mississippi. So I had high chair duty. I was feeding Tiffany pureed peaches or something like that. And Scott, as I lifted up the spoon to her mouth, I noticed her left eye was quivering. Now, if you got kids, that's not right. So we freaked out a little bit, and down the street was a doctor, and he said, "Yeah, come on by. I'll take a look at her." He looked at her and said, "It's probably something called a strabismus, which is basically your eye muscle development. She'll probably outgrow it," he said. But he said, when you get back to Atlanta, where we lived at the time, you might want to see a specialist. Got back, saw a specialist. He says, probably a strabismus, but let's take a picture just in case, a CAT scan. So scheduled the CAT scan, went to the hospital, did the CAT scan, came back home to our little rental home. Literally, as I was opening the door, the phone was ringing. Ran into our little kitchen, picked up the phone. It was the doctor. I mean, that's unusual calling us this quickly. He said,
Right.
Charles, we've got the CAT scan results, and your daughter has a lesion on the brain. Now, lesion in my mind is like a sore. You give antibiotic, it goes away. Then he said something that changed our lives and directed me on this whole mindfulness path. He says, your daughter has a brain tumor. 1-year-old girls aren't supposed to get it.
Wow.
So fast forward to Tiffany's now doing well, 35 years old. She's going to seminary. She's had 10 brain surgeries. She's had experimental treatment. She's one of the most written up brains at Rush Medical Center in Chicago.
Yeah.
That experience of living in this world of neurology and neuroscience, and me viewing Tiffany and seeing when a brain is not working well, what it does, I asked myself, is there potentially something wrong with my brain? Not that I had a brain tumor, but I still struggle with anxiety and worry and some of these kind of things, even though I was a committed Christian. I did all the spiritual disciplines.
Yeah.
So that led me on this journey of mindfulness from a biblical perspective that led me to get this degree and do my master's thesis on that, led me to write this book on Holy Noticing that Moody published a couple of years ago, and has really led me down this pathway that has made a profound difference in my life as I understood mindfulness from a biblical perspective.
Now, look what you're doing and we'll talk about mindfulness in a minute, but look what you're able to do now because of a phone call.
Yeah.
As a result of an observation in a high chair.
Yeah.
And how, we were just talking about constraints and how that generates creativity. This is like a long-term 30-year constraint that you have been able to use in the right way. So talk to us about mindfulness.
Yeah, well, mindfulness is a hot topic today. I think in 2019, maybe 2018, I know 2019, Apple's app of the year was a mindfulness app. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's using it there. The number of papers has risen literally exponentially studying mindfulness.
Yeah.
The vast majority are from a material reductionist perspective. A material reductionist is a person, he says, basically, we're just hormonal secretions and neuronal firings that makes us live meat. And when we're dead meat. And there's nothing left. That's oversimplifying.
Yeah.
Well, I have a biblical worldview that tells me that there is more to this life than just flesh and blood.
Right.
And by the way, a lot of secular scientists are coming around too. They wouldn't be a Christian, or a God-fearer, but they're realizing there's this component of truth that is not what happens in the laboratory that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah.
So
let me pause you just for a second.
Sure.
I like to look at the use of words in the language since 1800. This is the word mindfulness, and it shows. I don't know what year this is, 1960, 70, 80, 2000 something. It takes a huge, it was never used in the 1800s and the 1900s. Now we are talking about interview. So just for what it's worth, I thought I would
add that. Yeah.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, mindfulness, because it is primarily in the secular realm, strong, a number of books, most of the books are written have a Buddhist leaning. I felt there were just not much out there that had a biblical perspective. So I had to discover, okay, is mindfulness just a Buddhist thing? Is it just, Well, I discovered it was not.
No.
Matter of fact, the Pali language, which is the language of Buddhism, the word mindfulness that's translated mindfulness in English comes from the word sati. The Hebrew language precedes the Pali language. The Old Testament was written in the Hebrew language. You look in the Psalms. David preceded the
Mindful.
Buddha by a few hundred years.
Yeah.
He talks about this all the time. He doesn't use the word mindfulness, but he talks about meditating and being still before God and quiet before God. So, from the believer standpoint, we had this clear early precedent in the Old Testament of this practice, though it wasn't called mindfulness. It's a relatively newly translated word. Not only that, you look at the history of Christians from the early church on, you find our early church, many early church fathers, and then even people that we would most likely think of, the evangelical, like Calvin, like A.W. Tozer most recently. There's this rich thread of biblical mindset people in history that have embraced what we would call mindfulness and have written about it. So you have the biblical pattern in the Old Testament. You have rich Christian history. You have the New Testament. A beautiful example of this, of mindfulness, is the story when Jesus visited Mary and Martha's house. Remember the story that Martha, she was going to make a 7-course meal. She was upset, very upset in the kitchen. And what was Mary doing?
Wasting her time.
Wasting your time. That's right. Sitting at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus lovingly admonished Martha and said, Mary has chosen what is best. So here's a picture of Jesus. And Jesus was often fully present. Well, not often. He was always fully present in the moment to the person he was with, or the people he was with. So you have this rich biblical tradition. You have this rich historical tradition. Then you have the science that's telling us the great value. So all that being said, I define mindfulness. I call it holy noticing. That's just a term I use. So interchangeably, holy noticing and mindfulness. Here's how I would define it. First of all, it's an art. It's not a science per se, even though science supports it. Holy noticing is this: noticing God and his handiwork, our relationships, and our inner world of thoughts and feelings. So fundamentally, it means being fully present right now, being aware of God's presence, his power, his provision, his creation, being aware and fully present for those that we're with, being aware and fully present for what's going on inside of us and our minds and our emotions. So strong basis for believers to use this. And the research is telling us all kinds of incredible benefits.
For example, what are,
okay.
for instance?
Harvard University says that the common thread in chronic disease, like immune system disorders, cancers, diabetes, although a lot of other factors, is that the immune response is out of hand and out of whack.
Okay.
And this is when all these, we cut ourselves. God created our bodies to send these little worker bees to, we get inflames and it brings healing, or if we get a bug in us, then inflame, the immune system kicks in. And COVID is really part of one of the theories is it just explodes the immune system, where the immune system just starts doing bad stuff. So one of the benefits of mindfulness is it decreases the unhealthy immune response. That's one benefit. Second benefit is the stress response. Part of the stress response is if the stress factor goes on more than just a little bit, cortisol kicks in. It's called the stress hormone. Now we need cortisol. It helps us metabolize our food. It's a lot of good benefits. If it stays in our system too long, it begins to create wear and tear on our body. It's called allostatic load. And what they're finding is mindfulness, as it's practiced, can decrease some healthy amount of cortisol in the body. So those are kind of some fundamental benefits, but also it helps in sleep. They found that it actually helps in reducing temptation. They've done studies on like people who are alcoholics or smokers, and those who practice mindfulness, it helps them deal with the temptations to take another puff or have another drink.
So it's almost like it's an atomic habit. It's an atomic thing. In other words, when you can do this, when you become mindful, you impact multiple other
Yes.
areas.
Yes. That's
Wow.
exactly right.
Okay.
Not only personally, but relationally too. Couples who practice mindfulness just get along better. Part of it's probably because they're not in their mind when their spouse or their partner's talking. Rather, they're present and they're really understanding and not reacting, and which bodes for better relationships.
I wish we had more time, and we'll probably get back on together and talk about more of this. But my mind goes toward the four basic personality types, and the impact. Like if I'm a personality that I'm always thinking, always going, just all the time, that mindfulness, I would think I would have to do things differently to become mindful than the methodical, slow, the thinker kind of person, right? So it's highly personal and
Mhm.
highly effective.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And the reality is, for some, mindfulness is easier than from others. A real activist to sit still for 15 minutes is hard to do. But for
Yeah.
someone who's a little more introverted, sitting still, being alone is not as difficult.
Wow. Well, Charles, thank you so much for sharing this insight for us. And I'm praying that those who are listening are able to get that little bit of inspiration that they need to become more mindful, to look into it a little bit more. Like you said, there's a lot being written. It's not for a lack of information.
Mhm,
It's for a
mhm.
lack of implementation. So
There
we
you go.
want to look at that, and thank you so much. Charles Stone can be found at charlesstone.com. And he is one of our subject matter experts in the exclusive interview series. Charles, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Great being with you, Scott.
All right. We'll talk to you later.